I'm using framing tape. It's not gum tape, it's actually just like masking tape, so you can use that as well, and it's a little bit kinder to watercolour paper, and I just quite like using it. You must have a little practice on the paper you're using before you go fully into the painting, just to check to make sure that this framing tape or your masking tape doesn't tear your paper when you remove it. So I'm just sort of tearing strips off of it. Now it looks easier than it is. You kind of have to practice that a little bit, sort of tearing. So just have a little practice and don't get too frustrated. A lot of my students had a little practice, and bit by bit they got used to it. And do save your little scraps because they can work for the smaller trees in the background. And don't worry about the straight edge because we'll sort of sort that out later with some sponging and spattering techniques. First things first, once you put all your framing or masking tape stuck down, wet the sky area and then paint a very pale blue wash just in the sky area, wet in wet, and then wet the grass sort of area, the foreground area, and then paint a sort of a yellowy wash, wet in wet. And then I picked up some of the Quinacridone gold here, painting wet on wet as well. I'm using a really large round brush, but use what you have, and I'm painting this sort of in patches around the yellow, wet in wet. If you don't have the gold, remember you could use something like raw sienna or yellow ochre, whatever you have. So what I'm doing now is putting a very light green down in the foreground. Everything's still wet in wet. If you find your painting is drying out a little bit, just give it a little spritz with a spritzer bottle. Or if you find that it's always drying out too quickly, work on a smaller scale while you are learning watercolour. It's a great tip for you there. So what I'm doing now, still using that large brush, I'm making up some lovely light greens using yellow and the green. This is the sap green, but use whatever green you have. And if you don't have a green, use a blue, and whatever blue. Just add more yellow than the blue or the green. So you just want to fill this foreground area in, and if you don't like what you've done, just run this under the tap, wash it off and start all over again. Even if there's staining on the paper, it's fine because it'll all add to the painting. So I'm putting on a darker green now. That's the turquoise with the yellow and the Quinacridone gold, whatever you fancy. Just put this darker green. The paint is damper, so it's not as wet, but the paper is still very wet. I've mixed up some really dark green now. That's the turquoise with the Quinacridone rust. But if you don't have those colours, remember, just use the Prussian blue, and a burnt sienna or burnt umber will be absolutely fine. I'm painting this damp into wet, so the paint's creamy and the background's wet. If your background's damp, don't worry, that's fine. If it's drying off a bit, again, give it a spritz with a spritzer bottle. I've left some little gaps in between here. I'm mixing up some delicious dark paint, and I'm using my lovely large size 14 brush, and I'm really sort of covering the paper here. The size of the paper I'm using is 14 by 10 inches, and it is a rough surface. I'm giving my painting a tilt now just to get everything moving, blending together, creating some atmosphere. I'm using a natural sponge now to sponge creamy dark green onto this damp, wet surface. So don't worry how it is, just get this paint really creamy as you can. So you need to use tube paint to do this. It's very difficult to do it from pans to get it really creamy. So I'm painting this, or printing this really, onto the sort of sky area, which is dried off, but it's fine, it's absolutely fine. Don't do it too much over the sky because you'll lose your light area, so just be careful. So in the middle of that there, I'm sort of really trying to keep just the light of the sky, and I'm really getting thick creamy paint now. I'm painting it on the left hand side of the foreground there. The background is still damp and my paint is really creamy. When I am pressing, I'm pressing very gently. So it might look like I'm really stamping hard, but that's just me sort of finessing. So press very gently because you get a nice print. I'm using the plastic card now. That's just an ordinary store card cut up to scratch away at the surface of the paper to create permanent sort of lines. They're very thin lines, and now I'm just sprinkling table salt, So this sort of later on will absorb the paint and create some lovely textures. While that salt is working, I decided I was going to use a little bit of warmth in the foreground. So I've sponged some of the quinacridone rust onto that sort of middle ground area. So the surface of the painting is damp now, and so is my sponge, so it's quite creamy. And I'm putting some very, very dark green paint into the foreground. Now I want to be able to scratch this out with my plastic card. If you're not comfortable with that technique, don't put this dark paint in. It's just another technique to create texture. So because otherwise it'll be too dark in that foreground. So now you can see here I'm scratching off to reveal the light yellowy sort of underpainting. So just be careful when you're doing that. So I'm just scratching away, lifting off this paint. It is such fun to do because you're creating sort of dark and light textured effects. I'm throwing everything at this painting. I'm having great fun. So once your salt has created some texture and sort of absorbed the paint, dry your painting with a hairdryer or leave it for a couple of hours to dry. And now I am brushing off the salt with my kitchen towel, just getting rid of it all before I start the next stage. What I'm doing now is I'm spattering yellow, creamy yellow Hansa yellow light paint with my size 2 brush. You have to kind of water it down a bit and spatter it to create texture and the appearance of flowers, little wild yellow flowers. The other great thing that this does, it creates light as well. So you can spatter this over darker areas and it kind of shows up and it looks lighter because it's quite opaque. Once you've finished blow drying your painting again, peel off your masking or framing tape. I'm hoping it doesn't tear the paper. Remember to test this beforehand. So I'm just going to remove all the pieces of framing tape and I'll be ready to start painting the silver birch trees. I'm using my size 2 brush and I'm using lamp black with the quinacridone rust, slightly watered down. It's quite creamy paint. I don't even mind if it's not transparent. And I'm just putting these marks on the silver birch trees. For longer videos with lots more tips and techniques, with lots more voiceover and drawing templates, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about this are on the top right hand corner, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Once you finish putting the marks on your silver birch trees, you can start putting some shading, and I'm putting it on the right hand side, and I've got a very watered down black with a tiny touch of the burnt sienna and the blue. This is really watered down. I'm putting it on the right hand side, so make sure all your light then comes from the left, so keep all the shading on the right hand side. I'm using a little bit of white and yellow mixed together with my size 2 brush just to paint in a few more lighter grasses to finish off this painting. Just these little lights are so important. With watercolour you work dark to light. I'm putting a few little branches in here and there, very thin branches, with my size 2 brush and some ivory black paint. So I'm going to remove the framing tape now to reveal a lovely white border. And here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Just click Patreon in the description below. You will get access to my exclusive tutorials and downloadable outline sketches and longer, more in-depth tutorials. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.